I want to welcome you to this workshop, Calling an Idea into Form with Disentangled Tech. I'm Trisha Ballard, and I'm going to be your guide today to breaking your big vision into something that's ready to build. And you don't need to have a tech background or knowledge of code to get started. So I know that, especially for intuitive founders, there can be a little bit of a disconnect when it comes to building tech products. And I want to tell you, first off, you are absolutely exactly where you are supposed to be. Maybe you've got, an idea, a spark, something drew you to this workshop. And I want to just tell you right now, whatever that is completely valid. Even if through this process you discover that it's not ready to come across into form, the idea itself is still very, very valid. And you don't need a degree in computer science. You don't need 20 years of development experience. And you also don't need to run out and hire a development agency or, create a 40-page technical spec in order to get started. All you need is that idea, that spark, that energy. And through this process today, we are going to have a calm, structured, intuitive, neurodivergent friendly process that's going to help you evaluate that idea and bring it into a place where it's ready to become form. All right. So let's get started. Let's take a moment. Let's ground into where we are and ground into the intention of clarity, because that's what we're here for. Clarity is an act of self-support, and it's going to save you so much stress and overwhelm in the future. So give yourself this time. Hopefully you've brought with you a notebook or some way that you can get your ideas out of your head and onto paper, whether that's digitally or physically, because this isn't just an hour where you're going to listen to me talk. We're going to work through this, and you're going to work on your idea and come out the other end with a lot more clarity. So let's talk about why this process is necessary. Because if you weren't stuck, then you wouldn't need me, right? You wouldn't be here. And so I want to share some of the reasons that I've personally gotten stuck when I'm building tech products. And I fully admit that I'm probably better off than a lot of people because I do have a degree in computer science. I've got the 20 years of experience. I know how to code. And yet I still get stuck. And part of it is a fear of having an idea and not knowing how exactly to get it from this vision in my head into something tangible. Sometimes it's just sheer ADHD overwhelm of all the moving parts and all the little bits that have to be done. Sometimes it's perfectionism. It's, well, if I can't build it exactly the way I see it in my head, then I can't even get started. For some people, there's even developer trauma where maybe you've taken your idea to somebody a developer, a technical person, and they've instantly ripped it apart and told you all the 743 reasons why it won't work. Been there, done that. It's not fun. And I want to really call out the entire tech industry on this because, and I'm calling it out from the inside, I've been there. I've been part of it. We like to use a lot of jargon. We really love our 3-letter acronyms, and it creates a power imbalance because if you're sitting in a room describing this vision that you have, and expert starts rapid fire questions and talking, and they're using words you don't even understand, sometimes you can feel like you're the only one in the room that doesn't get it. And that is deeply unfair. I'm just going to say it. You are not the problem. Your idea is not the problem. You're missing the translation. Developers don't speak the same language that we do as visionary founders. And we don't speak the same language they do as developers. So of course we don't communicate. So now that we've kind of called out the problems in the way that this process usually works, let's shift gears and vision into what it could look like. What if your idea could move from the energy of an idea into clarity and then into form without overwhelm, without jargon, without pressure? I mean, that's a world I want to live in. So let's start at the beginning with your idea. Every idea has an energy, a vibe, right? And as a founder, you don't have to define every single detail of the entire product. All you actually have to do is bring that first aligned expression of the idea into form. Once you've done that, then it can stand on its own. It exists in the world, and you can expand on it if you choose to. You can hand it to a development team to expand. There's a lot of things you can do, but you don't have to. So I would love to take just a minute. I've been talking now for almost 10 minutes. I'd love for you to drop your big idea into the chat. And I want to remind you, it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be polished. It doesn't have to be ready. Maybe it's just a question, an inquiry, but I'd love to know what brought you here today. While you do that, I'm going to move on and talk about some of the other things that you might have experienced as you kind of move into this development process. So earlier I mentioned that, in the tech industry, we really love our 3-letter acronyms. And I want to define one for you here right now because you are going to hear this. If you get within 20 miles of a developer, you're going to hear about an MVP. And that means minimum viable product. And to be honest, I hate that term. I despise it. To me, it's got major tech bro energy. It implies restriction and, do the very least you can to get by. And that's just so not my vibe. I also feel like it's got a lot of pressure and judgment in that phrasing. Minimum viable, is it viable or is it dead? I mean, that's so, I don't know, it feels icky to me. So I don't work that way. And I invite you not to work that way either. Instead, I call it the visible form, the simplest expression of your idea that can stand all by itself on its own. Doesn't have to be a full app. It doesn't have to cost you $300,000 in development expenses and 18 months of development time. And it shouldn't. It should be something simple that shows to you, to the universe, to the world, that this idea is ready to come into form. So let me give you a couple of examples. Let's say that you are thinking of building a journaling app, maybe for your coaching practice. The earliest visible form of that might be to let your users just write one single entry. And then from there, you can expand, right? You're not restricted to that early visible form. It's just a place to start. It's a core. Maybe you add a prompt library or reminders or coaching to it later. But that's all that can all exist out in the possibility. Right now, we're concerned about what is that essence, that simple form. Again, maybe you want to build a client portal, and the earliest visible form is they need to be able to log in and view content. Later on, they can upload documents, you can add messaging, you can add automations, whatever you want, whatever's calling you, whatever the app wants to become. So yeah, it's the same thing as an MVP, but I love expressing it in a more expansive way. So the key principle that you want to understand here as you are imagining into what this looks like when you bring your idea into form is we aren't going to build every possible feature all at once. We're only going to bring the idea's essence into form. We start with essence, we move into structure, and it all begins with intent, with intention. So I work in a sort of a 3-phase process, and I'm going to actually lead you through this process as part of today's workshop. But I want to give you a little bit of a preview of what's coming. So we start with vibe. That's the vision, not the vision, that comes later. It's the energy, the essence, the emotional arc, the metaphors, the visualizations. And then once we have that, then we move into vision. And you'll notice that we're slowly coaxing the idea from the intangible to the tangible. And in the vision phase, we think about its purpose. Why does this thing need to exist? What's the transformation? Who's it for? Who's going to use it? And then finally, we're going to think about the visible form of the idea. And that's the moment when it really crosses that veil into reality and becomes tangible. All right. Are you ready to get started? I'm going to give you just a minute or two to free write, to sketchnote, to do whatever feels good to you with the inquiry of what is the essence of your idea? What is the energy of it? And I'm going to invite you to feel into it instead of using your kind of more logical thinking brain to figure it out. All right. Right now, I want to introduce you to the Founder's Field Guide framework. And this is really the heart of our work together today. This is a process that I have developed for myself over the last 20-something years of building digital products and really doing it in this intuitive, vision-led way that isn't tied down to the It's informed by the traditional software development cycle, but it's not restricted to that. So I'd love to just lead you through this framework at a high level. So I'm going to use this journaling app as an example, but I'd love for you to work along with me using your app and your idea as well. So let's get started. All right. So we start in the vibe phase with the inquiry of what does this feel like? And when I really felt into the feeling the essence of this journaling app, it felt calming to me. It felt like a warm cup of tea, soft light, some quiet, just relief in the day. And so the summary that, the pattern that I found with those responses was that it felt gentle and grounding, something for a quick reflection. Next, we move into metaphors. Um, if the idea were a visual, a metaphor, what would it be? And the first image that came to my mind, because I'm sort of a fantasy nerd, was walking on a dark path in a foggy forest and holding a lantern. And it was that circle of soft light. But in more practical terms, it felt like breathing room in my very chaotic, crazy days. A tiny ritual that lived on my phone for just a reset. And what came up for me there was that it's not about productivity. It's really about clarity. It's about being able to see clearly. So the next inquiry is about the user, the person using your app. What should they feel before, during, and after? Just like any other work that we do, it's about transformation, right? And so when I was going through this process with the journaling app, I imagined that, okay, how am I feeling before I pick up the app? And I thought, I'm feeling scattered, overstimulated, overwhelmed. And those would be maybe those triggers that I would identify to open the app. And how would I feel as I'm typing that journal entry? And, I thought, okay, maybe I feel my shoulders relax. Maybe I feel more grounded, more settled into where I am. And then, after I'm finished, I feel lighter. I feel clearer. I feel like I can make sense of everything. So this is one of those North Star inquiries because everything that you do, every decision that you make for your app is going to support this transformation. And then the final inquiry in the vibe phase is about purpose. Why does this idea even want to exist in the first place? What is it trying to shift? For myself, I wanted my users to have a space where they can pause and feel heard, even if it's just by themselves. Maybe they don't have somebody they can text and say, hey, I just need to vent, or, I'm having a really rough day or something like that. But I know for myself, I don't have an hour to sit and make a cup of tea and light a candle and, write 3 pages longhand in the middle of the day. Well, I'm busy. I've got a thriving business. I've got kids. I've got dogs. I've got responsibilities. I can't just say, oh, no, I'm done. I'm going to stop for an hour and reset. I need something I can do in a moment. So those were the things that really came up in this journaling app for me. And when I looked back over my notes from all 4 of those inquiries, the pattern that emerged was that it was a gentle micro ritual for clarity. And so that sort of becomes, if you want to put it into more technical terms, that's your mission statement, right? That's the one thing that you are trying to do through building this app. All right. So that's phase 1 at a very, very high level, obviously. And I'd love to know what you came up with for your app. And if you're watching this on the replay, I really encourage you to pause here and consider those 4 inquiries. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the vision phase. This is where we are taking it one step out of sort of that ethereal, energetic ideation phase, and we're moving a little bit toward reality and the tangible. And we're going to start with our user constellation. The inquiry is very simple. Who's this for? Who is that person that you are building it for? And if you're like me, you probably have 3 or 4 different types of people who might use this, right? And you see here, I listed 3 different users. Overwhelmed founders, which I know we all can relate to that. Neurodivergent people who struggle with, sitting down and writing that 3-page journal entry. And just in general, people seeking clarity, but not pressure. Now, I know it's super tempting to want to make this big long list of all the people that might possibly use this. But for this first version, for this essence version, we want to narrow it down to 1. We can always add the others in later. And we're not telling them, you can't use this. We're not building for you. But what we're doing is really getting clear, getting focused. And so for me, I chose to narrow down to a founder who needs a tiny grounding moment in their day. So the next inquiry in this process is, what is the shift that this app creates for them? We kind of started feeling into this in the first phase when we talked about before, during, and after. But here we're bringing a little more structure to it. We're diving a little bit deeper and digging into it. So, maybe we're shifting them from scattered to centered, or from overwhelmed to grounded, to lean into that early visual metaphor from foggy to clear. So think about, what is that shift? And it's almost always going to be an emotional shift, right? Because as much as we like to deny it, we are emotional creatures. We make decisions emotionally, all these things. And then we turn around and find the data to back up the emotional decision. So let's start with the emotional shift, and then everything else follows from that. This is a really, really critical one that I never, ever skip. What should the app always or never feel like? So again, we're creating an experience, right? And every single feature that you evaluate, every UI decision, pardon me, no jargon, user interface. UI is user interface. So it just means the look and feel of the app. It should support what you've put here in the always and avoid what you put in the never column. So for the journaling app, I want it to always feel gentle, simple, calming, and non-judgmental. And it should never, ever feel overwhelming, noisy, or demanding. So for example, if I am thinking about, okay, I want to put in a notification feature. Well, I'm going to be constantly evaluating how I'm going to do that based on these two columns of words, right? Okay, so I know that my notifications, if I have them, have to be gentle. They can't be noisy or demanding. So that's how we're going to use this. All right. And then the final inquiry in the vision phase is, what is the one thing this app must do to fulfill its essential purpose? And again, if you're anything like me, you want to create this amazing, beautiful, feature-rich thing to give to your users, but we're going to pull back to just that essence. What is that one thing that this app has to do in order to fulfill its purpose? So for the journaling app, it needs to give the user one tiny grounding moment with a simple journaling prompt. Everything else is expansion. And we have full permission to expand once we've brought this essence into form. So the summary or the output of this phase is that we have now a clear human-centered intention for the app. Phase 3. Now we are at the point of pulling that idea into visible form, into a tangible form. And we start with flow. We need to know what is the simplest flow that creates the transformation. And by flow, what I mean is the steps that the user will take within the app. Okay. So when I first did this exercise with the journaling app, I had a list of, I think, 7 or 8 steps. They were going to open the app and log in, and then they would see their prompt and they'd write their journal entry and they would save it, and then they could share it with someone or they could add a photo. And I had to kind of pull myself back a little bit and go, okay, we can do all of that, but what's the simplest? And these are the 5 steps that I came up with. Well, they have to open the app. They will see a gentle prompt. They'll be able to write their short journal entry. They're going to tap a complete button to save it. And then at the end, they're going to receive an affirmation. And, I could have left off step 5, but going back to our earlier vibe phase, we decided that this was going to be a micro ritual. And so I felt like it really needed a completion step. So that's why I left that in. So here's our feature constellation. And this is where we get to save all of those expansive ideas that we've had, that are wonderful and amazing, but they're not part of the essence. And so we don't want to lose them, but we're also kind of setting them aside. We're not going to do this right now. We're going to do this in the next version. So, I thought maybe the prompts could be randomized or tied to the phases of the moon or the astrological features or something like that. I thought, well, hey, maybe it'd be really cool to have some light animation going on. maybe a daily reminder to come and journal, maybe a way to save or archive your journal entries. And I wanted to make a note for myself that I wanted to have a really calming palette, nothing too bright and exciting, because this is supposed to be a grounding ritual. All right. So again, now that we're in this visible form phase, we're really starting to deal with the tangible. And so we want to think about the information, the data that this app has to deal with, right? And again, I'm saying this over and over because it's that important. We're only dealing with the essentials. So we need to have a library of prompts. We have to be able to, we have to save the written entry. And maybe we want to have a timestamp or a date stamp on it so that they can, put them in order or, something like that. So there's only really 3 data points in this whole app. All right. Then next, we want to sketch out the screens that they're going to experience. And sometimes I will just literally make a verbal list. Sometimes I will sketch it out by hand. This is a place where we don't need to get super caught up in, I have to go learn Figma, or, I have to have this really beautiful look and feel all figured out. We'll get there. But right now, all we need is what you have on screen right now. What are the screens that they're going to see? So we're going to have a very gentle welcome screen. They're going to have a single prompt with a text box to enter their journal entry and a button to save it. And then they're going to have that affirmation screen at the end. And then I keep kind of going back and forth. Whether do we want to have them look back over their journal entries is that essential or is that an expansion? And that's something that if I were going to build this, I would have to kind of really dive more deeply into. So the end result of this visible form phase is that you know what you're building, right? You have a description of your app. So in this case, a grounding microjournal that honors the vibe. It fulfills the vision. We have been very good and not succumbed to shiny object syndrome. We've kept it to the essentials. And so we can build it quickly and it'll stand alone. Yeah, you can do this. And ideally, by the time you finish this process, this third phase, you should really feel confident that, okay, this isn't that huge. I can build this. Or I can speak confidently to a developer and tell them exactly what I want, because I've gone through all of this process of clarifying my idea. All right. So let's kind of talk about what do I do next, right? You've got this framework, you've got this, all of these descriptions and, ideas in a tangible form. So how do you build it? There's a lot of different ways. None of them are magic bullets. That's something that I really, really emphasize because we are living in a time where technology is advancing really fast. It honestly reminds me of the late 90s, early 2000s when the web was just exploding. Well, that's kind of where we are with code and building apps. The possibilities and the tools are exploding. And so, unfortunately, there's this tendency, especially when you have companies marketing tools to you, that they really gloss over the complexity and the pre-work that you have to do in order to get the best out of the tools. And, they kind of make it sound like you can build that in an afternoon. So I want to just be really clear. None of the ways to build these apps are magic bullets, but they're tools. And what a tool does is amplify the clarity that you have. Tools, developers, they build exactly what you tell them to. So if you're not really clear on what that is, you're not going to get what you want. And as the founder, your job is to create clarity. So let's talk about the 4 pathways to building your app or your product. We've got low code and no code tools. You can go the old fashioned route and hire a development team. And then there's this new method that literally came out early 2025 called vibe coding. And I'm going to explain what that's all about. We're going to dive into all of these. Don't worry. I'm not just going to hand you the slide and walk away. But so it means that you have a lot of options depending on your goals and where you're at and what you want to do. So let's talk about it. All right, low code tools. So it's things like Bubble and Lovable. They are a really great way to get started fast and to build prototypes, to build kind of that very, very first version. The downside of these is that it can be really easy to end up in the weeds, especially if you don't have a strong code background. They don't always scale well, and you tend to get locked into that platform. So, the good and the bad, right? You use the tool for what it's good for, but you go in with your eyes wide open. Okay, so no code tools. These are things like Figma, Canva, Clickable, Miro. They're wonderful for visualizations. They're great for illustrating clarity. So, for example, if you wanted to take your app or your idea to investors, even to a development team, and say, okay, this is exactly what I want to build. They're amazing for that. What they can't do is actually build the tool. You know, they can build you a click-through prototype, but they don't do the logic behind it. So let's talk about hiring developers. Whether you, go out and hire a freelance developer or a development agency, really, really powerful option because you're going to get custom code. You're going to get exactly what you tell them to build. It can also be risky because if you don't have that clarity for exactly what you want, and that's what we build through this field guide process, you're going to get what you tell them, not what you want. And also there's that communication breakdown potentially where, your project ends up going 6 months over time and $100,000 over budget because, the developer said one thing, you understood something A and what they meant was thing Z. So, definitely a powerful choice, but do it with clarity. Make sure you're working with somebody trustworthy. There are, like any other industry, there are plenty of scammers out there. So just be really careful. And then I told you that I would talk about this new way of coding, this new way of building called vibe code. I call it the tech witch path. It is AI assisted development. I really think of it in terms of having a junior developer that lives in my laptop, and I can tell these tools, there are several of them, I want to create this feature. And this is the flow and form that I want it to take. And it can be, and I love it because it's very intuitive, it's very nonlinear, and it's also very powerful. You can also end up in the weeds. You can, it doesn't replace a really experienced, intuitive developer or a guide. It still builds exactly what you tell it to, just like any other tool, any other developer. But what it does is it means you don't have to learn how to code and you don't have to, it can really, really cut down your development costs significantly because you need a senior developer instead of a senior developer and 12 juniors or something like that. So it's really powerful, but you still have to have that foundation because if you don't know what to tell it to build, you're going to end up with a mess. So let's do a reality check here really quickly. Right now, what you have is an idea and you're starting to become clear about it. You're building clarity. And you're doing that through information, right? You're intuiting information about your idea. You're thinking about it. You're feeling into it. And clarity then builds structure. And structure is what's going to give you momentum when the excitement builds off. I can talk. When the excitement wears off. But unfortunately, there's a break here because you need support as well. Because without support, without guidance, then momentum just becomes churn or you just kind of fizzle out and wander off anyway. At least that's been my experience, both with myself, with my clients. And so what I've found that the key, all three of these elements are absolutely essential to going from this idea to a completed product that you release to users and that is actually out in the world creating that shift that we wanted in the first place. We need clarity and information. We need structure and momentum, and we need guidance and support. I know that there's this idea out there of, the lone developer or the lone founder that's, building everything themselves. Been there, done there. The t-shirt is awful. Don't do it. You don't have to. You don't have to go it alone. And quite frankly, trying to do it all yourself and do it alone is about the most inefficient way you can possibly do this. We went backwards instead of forwards. There we go. So what I want to talk to you about next is sort of our next steps. Now that you've seen the Founders Field Guide process, the framework, you've got this and your next pathways, you can absolutely take this recording, hit pause, go through the inquiries and come out the other end with enough information, enough structure to take it into one of the low code, no code tools, to take it to a developer or an agency, and off you go. Absolutely. If you are looking for deeper support, I've got a program that I'm beta testing that I would love to invite you into. For 6 weeks, we are going to go into a really deep dive. I mean, obviously, in an hour, I can't go through the entire, all of the details of the framework. And so I, again, practice what you preach. I kept it to just that essence. And so in this guided cohort, we build out your founder's field guide. And that is your guide to this app. It's what is going to be your source of truth to help you either hire devs, use no code tools, or even start vibe coding for yourself. And it'll give you a really, really solid foundation to do any of that. And, I actually created this founder's field guide as I started it out as a Word document for myself because I was finding that I was getting lost in the weeds. I was losing momentum. My projects were fizzling out. I was spending a fortune on tools that I couldn't figure out how to use. And then once I did figure out how to use them, I wasn't getting what I wanted out of them. I was spending time arguing with my developers because they didn't understand what I wanted. It was frustrating. And so I took a couple of months off of development and said, okay, I've got to figure this out. And the Founders Field Guide is what came out of that process. And so, now I'm sharing it with you. And because this is a beta cohort, I've never done this in this way with a group of people. I've done this with my private clients. I've done this with my own projects. This is a new way of bringing this into the world. And so if this is something that is exciting to you, I'd love to offer you some benefits to that founder's circle. You get several $100s off. We start in mid-January and we'll be ready to build by mid-February. You're also going to get coaching and personalized review of your field guide materials. And I'm limiting this to 5 founders because, excuse me, I don't want this to become, something where you kind of get lost in the crowd. I've only ever done this one-on-one with my private clients. So I'm only going to allow 5 people into this program. So if your idea is ready to come into form, I would be honored to be your guide. And if you have any questions about the field guide cohort, about the process, about vibe coding, I'd be happy to hang out and answer those. And if not, I will also put a link to the cohort application in the chat. And again, you're going to get this recording in about 24 hours. So I'll put a link to the application in that email as well, right? Thank you so much for joining me today. And I have been absolutely honored to spend this time with you and to be a part of bringing your idea into form. I hope to see you inside the cohort. Bye.